Chapter 3. Lyra. Lyra's head lolled to the side as she stumbled a fine line between nightmarish dreams and an unpleasant, painful consciousness. Her left eye throbbed, and she tried to open it to peer at her jostling surroundings. It was swollen nearly shut, and she winced. She imagined it was purple and green, like the time she had been kicked by a horse. Eldon had thought that was hilarious. Ada had been a little more empathetic, groaning and saying sorry over and over and over. As one of the stable keepers, he blamed himself, but it certainly hadn't been his fault. Memory flooded back, and the pounding in her head made sense. Her last memory was of the guard's gloved hand lancing into the air by her ear, of his cruel expression as he shoved her to one side. Then, a crack that echoed from one ear to the other. Wincing, Lyra tried to assess her situation. She wasn't in the dungeon any longer. She was in an enclosed wooden wagon lined with metal sheeting. The only opening was a tiny grate of a window at the back. She tried to sit as the wagon clunked along, every jolt racking her bruised body and nerves. Her wrists chafed against rusty shackles that held her hands high. Her fingers and hands stung as her heart struggled to push enough blood into them. Her corset was looser than it should have been, with several of the tightening strings ripped out. Her breasts were a sickly yellow hue, and the ache in her ribs told her they were the same, if not worse. The delicate light skin on her arms was marred with more bruises, and the tightness of her cheeks was uncomfortable. Thankfully, her teeth were intact, as was her nose, although it had bled profusely and stained her white undertunic. What did I do? She reflected as she was jostled left and right in the prison wagon. The caravan would have to leave without her, and quickly if they wanted no part in whatever this mess was. She whispered into the wind for her family to depart Shayal, to pack up the wagons and leave immediately. She whispered her capture, wrongful imprisonment, and the possibility of danger to them. Lyra was afraid for herself, but she was even more afraid of that whatever had happened to her might happen to them. This was how wayfarers were treated. Whatever offense she had committed or been accused of, she would be punished without trial or hesitation. It didn't matter whether the offense was real. To Eliza, she said to the whisper before it squeezed through the window grating and flew off. A faint sense of relief entered Lyra. Perhaps the whisper would be quick enough. This was not the first time one of them had been marked by a noble and taken. Iselin was the cautionary tale told to all Mascalan children. Iselin had led the wayfaring caravan when she was a babe. He had bounced her on his knee and let her play with his grizzled red beard as he sat on the second wagon in the train, his deep, guttural voice grounding out commands as his whip snapped by the ears of both beasts and men. Sometime later, he had offended the lord of a prominent castle, supposedly robbing him in the market square. 20 knights had sworn to the event's truth. They'd heard the scuffle and rushed into the Mandarer tent where their lord had gone, saving their beloved master and overcoming the murderous, road-roughened vagrant. That was the story, and it sounded as fictitious as the others told by orators late at night. Lyra heard it muttered among the uncles that Iselin had indeed offered the lord a beautiful charm, blessed with a powerful green magicka, but for a price. No wayfarer would give up such wares for free. Her mother's offering to King Hemel had been a rare and generous moment in a lifetime of hard bargaining and pursuit of coin. Iselin had apparently been arrested, his crimes and punishment announced that afternoon, and his previous wagon replaced by a much different one as he was shipped off to Tahai Mines. No one knew whatever happened to the charm. That was the way it was for wayfarers. That was why Mam wanted Lyra to escape this life, to settle with land and a stationary husband. Even with leaders as strong as Iselin, cousins as caring as Ada, and the protection of family, the caravan was less than Lyra deserved, according to Mam. Iselin had been Lyra's father, or so the uncles said. You never knew with wayfarers. and you never needed to. The Mascalon caravan had been one family, and family took care of their own. Lyra had been cared for by 10 more fathers and 20 more mothers during the years after Iselin was taken, and she had nearly forgotten about him until now. Would he have snapped his whip at the ears of the Shaialese noblewoman? Or the guards? Lyra thought so. Despite her aching bruises, she managed a half-smile in the darkness. Then she faltered. Iselin had been sent to High Mines. That had to be her own destination now, too. By the light, she had sung enough ballads and danced enough stories of treachery and just punishment to know the suffering that awaited her in Tahai. The mines were for the most demonic of evils, the most shameful of deeds, the most treacherous of lies. Surely, this was her death. Tahai Mines held no prisoners forever. She heard they died in the sweltering heat, burned and naked beneath the eye, their sins bared to the open. In Tahai Mines, their repentances were offered in vain, and the desperation to survive rivaled the desperation to die. As expected, Iselin had never returned, nor had a single whisper reached their ears of his fate. Again, Lyra whispered a warning into the wind. Leave Shayal. Eldon, Adrian, Ma'am, uncles and aunties, get out. Get away. She sighed as the second whisper disappeared into the darkness. Hopefully, they had already gone. Scene break. Long hours passed, and the tingle in Lyra's hands faded to a dull numbness. Her slender fingers were pale, but not broken. In the dry, creaking darkness, she was alone. If she was bound for Tahai Mines, no one was coming with her. A strong westerly wind nudged at the wagon as it trundled northward. The air tasted of salt and sucked the moisture from her tongue like eating unripe fruit. Even in the cloistered twilight of the enclosed wagon, Lyra was aware of the air around her, its flavor and character, its power. As it buffeted the side of the wagon, she thought of how great its source must be, far beyond Hamanual comprehension. Even she had little understanding of the air, and she was more gifted than anyone she knew. She scowled, then winced as it pulled at her cheek's tender skin. Why hadn't the air burst from her when she was attacked? It usually did, when she was truly afraid or startled. When Eldon scared her, leaping from the shadows of wagons with a scream, she would sometimes fling the air like a tumultuous breeze and knock him over. When she was upset, she would accidentally manifest a tempestuous wind, much like the one harassing this prison wagon, one which irritated the horses but cooled the sweat on their skin. Because they were soldiers, she thought, legitimate men at arms in the service of King Hemel, their shoulders carrying the weight of golden-edged yellow capes. That was why it hadn't occurred to her to fight back immediately. She resolved not to forget the next time. Whatever Tahai Mines held, she was certain it was going to be frightening. The wagon lurched to a halt, and she heard the driver whistle. "Hey, you useless cunt! Hey!" One of the hall beasts groaned, and Lyra heard the whip lashing out with a hard snap. "Piss off, boy," came another distant voice. The driver laughed. "That Pensick I hear up there. They let you run the gate. Let me in, I'm hungry for a hot meal." The gatekeeper grumbled curses, but Lyra nonetheless heard the creak of rusty hinges as the gates swung open. The wagon moved once again, bouncing onto a smoother, rhythmic surface. Chiseled stone blocks. She listened to the familiar sound of it as the wagon rolled along, then stopped. No one came for her. The driver hopped down and gave curt instructions to a stable-keeper, then yelled insulting greetings to several others. One passed by the small window carrying 2 tankards. "Just in time for a meal, as always," the stranger said. "Been doing this for a while," replied the driver with a chuckle. Lyra heard a knock on the side of the wagon. "What you got this time?" Just the supplies or a batch of criminals? She shook her shackles against the side in response. I'm not a criminal. Let me out, please. Let me go home. Lyra heard the driver snort liquid, then cough with laughter, but the stranger clambered up the back of the wagon and peered in at her. He raised his eyebrows. Please, I'm not a criminal, she repeated. He sneered. Convince the warden of Tahai, and then maybe you can go home. He leapt down, leaving Lyra staring after him. Warden? Like a dungeon keeper? The dungeon keeper in Shayal had been fair enough, at least forcing the guards to leave her alone. Perhaps the warden would be a fair man, too. A faint hope lit inside her tight chest, and she sat immured in her thoughts until the driver returned an hour later, as dusk settled with orange light beyond her window. They dropped off the pavement of whatever fortress they had been in, then began a steep descent, the driver cursing the entire way. Orange light faded into twilight. At first, Lyra took his oaths as artifacts of his obvious foul mouth and irritability. He had certainly not slept since departing Shayal, unless he'd dozed in the driving seat. But then, the wagon jolted to one side, and his exclamation was fearful rather than irritated. With the wagon still lopsided, he leapt from the high driving platform and jostled around the wagon, cinching ropes in place. Lyra could see one of the ropes lashed around the window grating. Then she heard him urging the haulbeasts forward, and the wagon moaned, its sluggish weight shifting from the rear left to the fore right. Lyra was jolted again as the stray wheel finally met ground. The driver wordlessly removed the ropes, peering in at her with a lantern in hand before resuming his place on the driving bench. His eyes were wide. They kept moving downward, slowly, erratically, and Lyra remained alert to every bump. The driver had been afraid. She could see it in his nervous expression and muted curses. The wagon negotiated a tight turn, and another. Sometimes she saw a dark rock face, and sometimes she saw only the starlit sky. Her heart fluttered with realization. They were descending a cliff, sidling back and forth on a narrow, perilous trail in a cumbersome wagon. She shuddered. The bleeding wall. The legendary break in the Tahai Desert that separated the civilized kingdom of Shayal from the vast northern wastes. The high Malagate cliff that bled with intricate crimson veins. Lyra realized that the first event had seen her precariously balanced between imprisonment and death, one wheel dangling off the edge and near to tumbling sideways. By the light, no wonder the driver had been afraid. She mumbled a prayer to Ea, the five-faced god, for protection, but her heart was brimming with doubts and too much fear. Every time they turned, Lyra gaped out at the shadows. The next day dawned, and still they descended, slow and careful, the driver ever meticulous as he chose his precise path down. Lyra gaped at the bleeding rock face every time it swung across her vision, disbelieving the terrible height of the cliff and understanding now how Shayal resisted incursions from the desert tribes. Finally, as the sun began to plunge to the other side of the horizon, the road flattened out, and the driver let out a whoop. "Hi, you cunts," he shouted. "Shh!" The wagon jerked to a stop, and he appeared at her window, clinking a key around until the entire door swung open. He examined her shackles before putting a sloshing skein to her chapped lips. Lyra gulped greedily, but he pulled the water away too soon. She pleaded for more. "Or food, please, sir." The driver stared at her dispassionately, then grabbed the front of his trousers with a lewd motion. "You can suck my cock, Monderer, if you're that hungry." He slammed the door, and she heard the lock click into place. Then he called back. "All I gotta do is get you there alive. That's all they pays me to do, and I sure as nothers ain't sharing my rations with you. Alone again, Lyra heaved a sigh that made her ribs ache. All she could see out the tiny window was the black Malagate wall. Hearing the driver settle down, Lyra fell into an uneasy sleep, plagued by nightmares of falling over the edge and being impaled on a bloody spire. Every time she awoke, the wind gusting against her wagon as if nudging her out of the fearful dream, she realized they were at the bottom. She was alive. But each dream felt as real as waking, and she found little comfort in her reality. Again she tried to pray, but her entreaties to the eye that burned above were suffocated. Dry dust settled on her eyelashes and stung her eyes, accumulating in her throat as phlegm. The prison wagon moved again, and the bouncing of rocky ground changed to a sinking, laborious drag. The black wall, at first filling Lyra's view, slowly lost its detail, and at last broke against sky far in the distance. They had entered new terrain. The sands. Scene break. Lyra lost track of the time, but it was somewhere in the afternoon when the wagon creaked and groaned to a halt. Shaking herself out of a stupor of soreness and worry, she looked around. She hadn't been asleep, but neither had she been awake. The last sounds had been the clop of hooves on cobblestone. They were in a courtyard somewhere. Was it the mine? Lyra felt the jostle of the driver leaping from the bench, then heard him unfastening the hall-beasts. They clopped over to somewhere nearby, where the thirsty creatures slopped at water. The splashing sound would have made Lyra salivate, but her mouth was parched. She whimpered relief when the driver appeared at her window, clanked at the rusty door, and reached toward her with the skein. Then a hand appeared on his shoulder, and he was shoved aside, revealing a Shaioli soldier. The man's gaze traveled from Lyra's face to her cleavage, then down to her waist and ripped skirt. He glared at the driver. "She looks a little rough, boy." "I didn't do nothin'," the driver whined as the soldier smacked the back of his head. "Get her out of those shackles and clean her up in the trough." To Lyra's disappointment, the driver set the skein down with a frustrated huff, but then he pulled the keys from his belt and unclasped her shackles. "I ain't fucking paid to wash 'em," he muttered, shoving her toward the soldier. Lyra's limbs had no strength, and she flailed, nearly falling from the wagon. The soldier caught her and waited as she recovered. His grip was iron, and she looked up at him with desperation. "Sir, is this to high mines? I don't belong here. It was a mistake. I didn't even have a trial." Her voice cracked in the dry air. His smile was strange as he set her on her wavering feet. "You want to see the warden?" "Yes, please, sir." The kindling of hope flared into a small flame, and she offered a quick prayer of thanks to the sky. She had to have faith that Ea would protect her and her family. "Drive boy, clean her up. You brought her in this condition. The warden won't be pleased." The driver groaned. He had already moved away to care for the hall beasts. They were Idraka, the strong, durable creatures of the desert. Their round humps, slender legs, and large padded feet were odd to Lyra, but they belonged here in the sands. Their necks were even spindlier than their legs. Their heads were all eyes and tongue with flexible, flaring nostrils. Their bodies were colored like sand pebbled with darker stones. The driver patted one of them before gesturing Lyra over to the trough. She cringed at the long basin. The froth of Idraka saliva clung to the edges, and the orangish-brown grit of sand danced across the bottom. As the driver shoved her forward, she cracked her knee on the cobblestone, and her hands splashed in the water. A few soldiers snickered along with the driver, and one of the Idraka groaned at her as it slurped more water. Lyra glared at the driver, but he merely shrugged. "You can clean yourself up, right? Do it then. Not my fucking job. Her limbs shook violently as she worked blood back into each one. Her fingers tingled. The odd numbness in her fingertips hindered her washing, but she nevertheless tried to splash the dust from her face and the dried blood from under her nose. She had no reflection save the trough water, but with luck she looked presentable. Respectable. Not a criminal. Perhaps the warden would believe her. She scooped the sand from the bottom of the trough and used it to scrub her arms and chest. The red chafing on her wrists and the bruises on her arms wouldn't wash off, though, and she imagined her face had bruising as well. She could see a hint of it in the murky water. Lyra looked up, realizing the courtyard's industry, the banging of barrels getting moved off the wagon, the chatter of bored soldiers, had ceased. Many of them were watching her. Her cheeks flared with an uncomfortable heat. Just get to the warden. Under the weight of the lewd stares, she adjusted her undertunic and retightened her corset, knotting broken strings back together. Her silky skirt was ruined, but it still covered her legs with its many layers. Lyra tried to rinse its tattered edges clean in the trough, but silk was delicate. The skirt would never be platform-worthy again. Finished, she stood tall and looked at the lead soldier. I'm ready to see the warden, sir. The soldier snorted, looking at her as though she were still filthy. Maunderer. Nonetheless, he extended an arm to escort her. She took it, still a little unsteady. With a deep, grounding breath, she thanked the burnished orange eye as it sank toward the horizon. The mote of hope stirred and danced inside of her, a leaf dancing in the wind. With her honesty and obvious innocence, she might be able to convince an authority like the warden of the truth. And maybe, just maybe, she'd be able to go home to her caravan. Lyra practiced polite and eloquent words as they entered the fortress keep and ascended a set of stone stairs. Her strappy, leather sandals made no sound on each step, but the soldiers' heavier boots pounded in the echoing stairwell. Or was that her heartbeat? They pushed into a larger room, an office with a small table and several chairs, a larger desk at one end, and a fireplace. A middle-aged man with jowls wrinkled from constant scowling sat at the desk, turning when they entered. My Lord Warden, the latest shipment from Shial City has arrived, said the soldier with a bow. The woman requested an audience. He pushed Lyra forward. The warden dismissed him, and the heavy office door shut behind Lyra with an ominous groan and a click. The man sidled closer, his deeply lined face twisting into a semblance of a smile. I don't grant many audiences, but then, most criminals aren't interesting. Lyra examined the floor. I'm not a criminal, my Lord Warden. It's a mistake for me to be here. Please, let me go home. The warden laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that bounced from the hollow office walls. So say many who come to me. Their excuse is thick and their lies obvious. Why should I believe you? Lyra looked up, her vision blurred by the sudden onslaught of tears. She struggled to find words, despite the whirlwind of practiced phrases she had considered in the wagon and stairwell. Her breath hitched as she fought back a desperate sob. Sir, you must help me. Aren't you a man of justice? The force with which he struck her swept her from her feet, and she banged into the table and chair on her way down. All the air was forced from her lungs as she landed, and she looked up at the warden with surprise and terror. The small candle of hope inside her flickered out. He was in her face, his hot breath on her cheek and his dark eyes glittering. His nasty snarl of a grin incised even deeper lines into his face as he spoke. I must do nothing. I am Lord Warden, and nearly everyone who comes here is innocent in some way. It doesn't matter. They're mine now.